So Colin made me talk about waterfowl, but the biggest part of my job is doing the active management on the refuge. If I had to choose anything to do on a daily basis, I'd rather be out on the tractor turning up some dirt, just about anything. So I like talking about this active stuff. I do this presentation a lot for state land managers, but just for the sake of time, I've taken it down to just a case example of Bosque, so I can show you how we do active management. But I do have a case example for the San Luis Valley if anybody's interested. The San Luis Valley is kind of interesting to look at because it was more of a passive system that we had to key more into the abiotic factors that were going on. And in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, it's more applicable to you guys because it's really the same type of system. We're a highly disruptive, high sediment load, evulsive type sand bed system. And so the management we do is really similar to the management that you guys do or can be done here in the South Platte. So I'll focus on that type of management, but if anybody has any questions about other stuff, let me know. And I guess one thing I would say, just to add on to what Colin was saying, is, moist soil value oftentimes is really tied to what you can do on your site. Those values, the way we put the seed values in there, the plant value, can really shift depending on what can and can't be grown on your site. Like in the San Luis Valley, it's a short growing season, perennial based system, so spike rush was like one of our #1 seed producers. We didn't get a lot of millet or smartweed or things like that there, so it becomes more valuable, and other plants become less valuable because the reliability of making that seed crop annually is really low. So there were a lot of places I wouldn't manage for smartweed because it wasn't ever going to make seed. It was just taking up space.
How would you know that? I mean, is there a region that, or is it trial and error? And
it's a lot of it is, understanding your growing season, definitely, because some of those plants are going to do good where you get these climate anomalies. When you go from a 70-day growing season to an 80-day growing season, that'll make a difference on some of those plants. But so a lot of that's just having to know when your plant's germinated and get a feel for if they're going to make it or not. You can follow the growing season stuff, but a lot of it's just being on the landscape and getting a feel. Multiple years on the landscape is going to let you know where your flexibility is and where your comfort level is. So we're going to step back. Some of the stuff I'm going to show is definitely going to be repetitive of what Colin has said, because I think it's really important to understand. If you understand how the system functioned, what the processes were that activated the seedbed, you're going to be far more likely to be successful in your management and fitting it in there. But it's important then to step back that, a lot of times we talk about disturbance, and people get really hinky talking about disturbance sometimes because you're talking about taking a landscape that's kind of functioning, is meeting some value, and you're talking about going in and disrupting it to a level it may not have seen since you've been a manager. And so, we get hesitant to talk about it, or to even do it. But annual and seasonal disturbance is part of every one of these systems. These were really disruptive systems. And so when we step back and look at what happened out there, there's erosion going on. That erosion could have been wind or could have been water. Understanding what the historical types of these processes were is important as well. There's sedimentation going on, drought. Here in the Southwest, drought is, we hate drought and we hate living through it, but it's our best friend in terms of doing wetland management and setting back succession in wetland systems. That was probably the big driver. Next to flooding events, drought was probably the next big driver, and stressing out those plant communities, making them susceptible to those big events. If you draw out a cattail community and then you send a huge slug of water across it, it's not going to stick around. But if it stayed wet through the growing season and the roots are set, it could withstand a big flood. Grazing. What kind of grazing happened out there? Was it small mammal? Was it large animal? Was it insect grazing? All of these gave different responses on the landscape. What kind of burrowing did you have out there? Was there invertebrate burrowing, small mammals, crayfish, herbs? All these things have different plant response associated with them. And here we don't get in New Mexico, and San Luis Valley was a really big thing, but the freezing and thawing events, that could dictate your plant community as well, and it could be one of your big disturbance factors. I know you guys don't get really big. What's frost here? How far is it set? 15 inches maybe? Frost line? 14. How far?
You can get 2 or 3 feet.
Oh, can it? Okay. So yeah, you can do a lot with that kind of frost. So this is what we call the wetland model, and it's how whenever I go to a new site, I have to think about the management that I might want to put on that landscape and how I'm going to do my moist soil. This is the process I start plugging my variables into so I can work through it and see how that site functions. So, I always start off with the climate. What's the temperature? What's my growing season? What's the precipitation? And not only how much precipitation do I get, but when do I get that? What's the form that precipitation comes in? You get a vastly different plant community in a snow-based system than you do in a rain-based system. What's the geomorphology like? What are the landforms that are out there on the landscape? What kind of features are out there? In these riverine systems, how did the system function? Was it evulsive, erosive, a sediment that drive, or what was the big thing going on out there? What's the hydrology? So, understanding the source, the timing, the type, the duration, all those things associated with hydrology. What are the soils like? If you don't understand soils, you're never going to understand the plants. You got to understand what's going on out there so you know how the plants can engage that soil substrate and how long they need to be there, what they need to do to make the soil viable and valuable to the plants. Once you have all of these, that's like the baseline information you have to have before you can even start thinking about what kind of critters do I want out there. A lot of times we go on the landscape and we say, I want this to be a really good mallard spot. And we drive our management around this objective of I want ducks on the landscape. Well, it may not ever be that. It may be something different just based on what the landscape can do for you. And understanding that up front is really important so you don't go down rabbit holes on your management. And then when you pile on the big one that a lot of times we overlook because we live in it, is what are the anthropomorphic effects out there? What's happened on the landscape that's changed how it functioned? If you don't put those in the context of how this system functioned historically, you'll lose sight of where you can be successful. So, this is kind of the modern setting of what we work in. In these floodplain systems, Colin was showing those flood events that happened. We had these huge scouring, erosive floods that came down periodically. Changed the, set back successions, set the stage for plant communities to come back in, annual plants to show up, energetic value of the site became increased. Well, once we started modifying the landscape, the first thing when we moved west as a people, what was the first thing we put in? Railroads. Where do we put railroads? We put them in floodplains because floodplains were flat. All of a sudden we had an impediment to how the water could move across the floodplain. Then we wanted to irrigate, so we started building dams and channels and irrigation ditches, and all of this started de-water, change the landscape. Then we put roads, then we put highways, now we have wind fields going in, then we have transmission lines, and all these things, then, our management options slowly become smaller and smaller and smaller on what we can do, and we lose sight of how the site functions. But the key that I always like to remember on that is there's always something that's still active out there. There's always something in the natural system that we as land managers have to think about and think about a technique to engage it. And that's where all these different moist soil techniques become important. It's not going to be any one thing that works for everybody in every place. It's going to be something that you as land managers stop and think about and say, the site used to work like this. I think I can stimulate it doing that. And a good case example that we used in the valley was all of the surface water. The valley functions on these big ice flows that come out of the mountains. They form these kind of seasonal ice packs that push across the valley, and that was the disturbance. It scoured the valley, changed it, made mineral soil available. Well, when they built all these roads, it stopped those ice flows from hitting the valley floor. So we just figured out ways to use our water right and the wells that were out there on the water right to create artificial ice flows across the valley. And so it was changing how we looked at using water, using it differently in the timing and availability, but enacting something that was a natural part of the system. We got really good plant response. So again, you have to think about your water management has to stimulate the hydrograph in some way. If you don't follow that hydrograph that Colin showed, you're going to miss the boat on plant germination or plant productivity. The more independent units you have, the more diverse you have, the more diversity you have on the landscape. And it's really up to all of us as being the professionals and being out there on the landscape to think about it. I mean, I couldn't go out on Elliott right now and tell you what to do. I'd be 100% wrong. Those of you that have been on Elliott probably have all kinds of ideas on what could or might work or isn't going to work because you've had the time to be in the system and understand it. So I'm going to talk about, I mean, at Bosque, we're probably on the far end of intensive management. I mean, we're super intensive management. So I'm going to show you how we use equipment to emulate or mimic these natural flooding events and how we get the plant response we need for that. And, you know, like I said, this is on the far end. Some places that you have here on the plat may be applicable, other places maybe not so much, but it's just to show you an example of how we used the tools that we had available to us to stimulate the seed bank. So again, match the equipment with natural processes, identify what historically functioned and what can still work, identify how you can use that tool to emulate it, so whether it's fire, grazing, a tractor, a shovel, how are you going to use it to emulate what happened out there? So here's the example I'll give you. Bosque, like I said, is highly disruptive under the natural processes, huge flood events, lots of debris in the system. I mean, we're really similar, again, to you guys in that we're coming out of the Rockies. So you got this steep river coming out of the Rockies and hits this flat basin floor. And so lots of velocity, then it slows down all of a sudden, lots of sedimentation falling out. I don't know if Platte's exactly the same, but in our system, the river is the highest point of the floodplain. So our floods function a little different. We have all the sediment that builds and builds the river. So, you know, you're down here on the floodplain, the river's up here. Then a big flood event comes and falls out of that. And so you get this like scouring, washing, and then the flood builds up. So we call that an avulsive system. And our oxbows tend to be real straight. We don't get these meandering oxbows. They further south you go, they call them rasakas. They function similar, but they look different. Natural disturbance regime, I think one of the things that's important is that regionally it was always happening, locally it was highly variable. So, you know, it's that variability that Colin was talking about in the system. Disturbance happened during the growing season, which is important to understand and how you would put your management there. If disturbance happened during the growing season, your plants are going to respond if you put your disturbance in there. If disturbance was outside the growing season, like in the San Luis Valley, make sure you understand that and emulate that. So this is the Middle Rio Grande. Like I said, there's yearly and seasonally variable flows, just like Colin was showing here on the Platte. Huge sediment load, really mobile bed, lots of diversity in size and shape of the debris that comes down, which is really important to how the soil structure is going to look after a flooding event. In terms of the modern floodplain, then what we've had happen, similar to you guys, is setback levees are all over the place. On the part of the floodplain that I work, there's only one setback levee. It's on the west side of the riverbank. And so our floodplain then is divided functionally into an active floodplain that experiences overbank flooding and a managed floodplain that never sees overbank flooding. So to get the plant communities and the wetland response, we have to manage that through the infrastructure that Colin showed you, stop logs, diversions, checks, all that kind of stuff. Right now, the active floodplain is about a quarter of its historic length, its historic width. Where we're at was about a mile wide. Right now, it's about a quarter of that. Our hydrology is very intensively managed. We have right around 150 independent wetland management units that we manage. Of those, about 80% of them have independent inflow and independent outflow, so we can emulate any type of hydrology or hydrograph that we want to do throughout the refuge to help with that diversity. But it's important in the context of that managed hydrology then, our hydrograph doesn't look like the native hydrograph or the historic hydrograph because of that shift on when water is available to us. So again, natural disturbance events were variable within year and among year, variable within location, and there were multiple disturbance forces acting together. So there was flooding, there was debris, there was erosion. There could have been arroyos being recharged that were sending different types of material down there. Lots of different stuff going on. And so under the natural conditions, this is what that natural disturbance cycle of the Rio Grande looked like. We would have a spring rising hydrograph, so as snowpack starts coming out of Wolf Creek Pass on the Rio Grande, we would start seeing that hydrograph rising late April, early May. It peaks right about the 1st of June. we can see our average flood event for a spring pulse was historically somewhere around 10 to 15,000 CFS. Monsoon pulses can be 27, 28, up to 35,000 CFS for a short duration. We get the peak of runoff, and then we get this descending hydrograph. And the descending hydrograph, I mean, if you put it in the context of what Colin's talking about, the descending hydrograph is your moist soil management. That's your spring drawdown. That's your germination event. That's what happens. And what we see in these southwestern river systems is that descending limb of the hydrograph is gone now. We don't get that attenuation of the river coming down, so that compromises, you know, some of our riparian species like cottonwoods and willows and all of that. But we can manage for that in these systems. Then we get the monsoons, and then our fall-winter base flow, which was right around, under historic conditions, probably 500 to 800 CFS. Right now, it's anywhere from 350 to 500 CFS in our winter base flow. So this is that within year and among year variation that Colin was talking about. And I think this is the key, because if you put us in the context of the natural system, we become the within year and among year disturbance. I mean, that's our role in there, is being disturbance. So in, you know, here's 2 years. That's among year variation. A really high event, you know, right around just under 6,000 CFS, and a low event that didn't get, it was about 1,900 CFS. So lots of opportunity for disturbance, low opportunity for disturbance. But then what's important is these little guys that happen within there, those among years, because what happens in these systems is, so they start to get wet, everything starts to get saturated, everything starts to loosen up. Then you get something like that. So that spike knocks over some trees, activates some rocks, moves something into the system. And then this event comes and moves those downstream. And so it's all these things acting together that are that force that creates that disturbance. And so this is our system, similar to yours now, channelized, armored on both sides in a lot of places, not a lot of opportunity for mobility, but you can still see some of the historic components of it. You know, we have this diversity of soil and rock size. We've got these vegetative bars and banks. You can see the turbidity of the system. That's probably a clear day on the Rio Grande. It's usually really, really turbid. It changes color throughout the season based on which arroyo is being activated, so you get all these different nutrients coming in as well. So we get these big events that come up, like Colin was showing. You know, the entire floodplain becomes activated. Stuff starts to become mobilized. And, you know, in these systems, there could be trees, there could be rocks, there could be cars nowadays coming down, houses, all kinds of stuff, sheds. You never know what's going to come down the system because people build on the floodplain. But that's all a force of disturbance. Then you get that high flow event and that scouring. So the way I like to think about it is, okay, so you had this aggressive event that moved all this junk down the river and tore up stuff. Then you get this high flow scouring. Well, that's like taking fine sandpaper down the floodplain. And it's just rubbing that sand right across the floodplain, and it's scouring away at some of those finer pieces that are still left out there. So what's happening during all these events is you're starting to get bank destabilization. Well, first you'll get bank incision. Then you get bank destabilization. Those banks start to fall in. Those become mobilized. They start to take out the sandbars. You get erosion and devegetation of the sandbars. The river starts to recede. You get this exposed bare soil. And then one of the things that gets overlooked, I mean, a lot of people look at wetlands and when they see drying and cracking, they get all sad. And we think about the Dust Bowl days. I get all kind of geeked up about it because there's a really cool process going on that I'll show you about. But this is when the finer nutrients are being cycled because of that drying and cracking and moving the soils at a fine scale. And so hopefully when you do this, you get this diversity of wetlands that can feed birds. So how do we do it then? How do you emulate a 27,000 CFS flood event? You know, what we do is we take a diversity of implements and we emulate the cycle and the results. And this is all built into, we have all of our wetlands are on it. If you go to any one of our wetlands, I have a 20 to 25 year disturbance schedule for each of them that can range heavy disturbance to really low disturbance. This disturbance then emulates the result of these long-term cycles. And we need to realize, though, in doing this, this isn't natural. We're moving outside of the natural event, so we have to understand when we are implementing something, how do we make sure it all fits into piece with the managed cycle. And so my managed cycle now looks like this. So rather than having my hydrograph rising in the spring like it would have historically, for most of my wetlands, my hydrograph is coming down because I'm trying to get my spring germination and get those plants growing and up and germinating. If I have a unit that just needs a little bit of kickstart to get different plants going in, I may go in and do a spring tilling, so really shallow soil disturbance to stimulate the soil. Then I go in and I do my mowing and summer flooding, which is really, for us, that's our cocklebur management. And because of our water right, we can do it. I know a lot of people can't do that one, but we go in and we mow all of our wetlands after the cocklebur gets about that tall, and we cut it below the cotyledon, and then we flood them for 3 days. We overtop that cotyledon for 3 days, and that'll kill 85 to 90% of the cocklebur, and it gives my millets and smart weeds and all of that stuff and irrigation. And you know it's time to take the water off because you'll see the millet starting to stick out of the water. And you pull the water off, cocklebur's dead, and you can increase your pounds per acre. I mean, you can double your pounds per acre with that because the cocklebur is so dense in our system, it'll shade it out. But again, that's tied to your water right. If you don't have the water, it's an action you can't do. But you can find other things that work in there to do it. You can use herbicides and some different things. Then my big period of disturbance is in the fall. That's when I'll do all my plowing, my disking, any kind of tilling I may want for the fall, light disking, or a combination of those. And then I do my managed winter flooding. And so, you know, if you look at my managed cycle compared to the historic cycle, it's kind of tilted. It's a couple of months different. And so when I'm trying to emulate this event, these big chunks, lots of junk coming down, this is on about a 20-year cycle for us. I go in with a bulldozer and a root plow on it, and I'm trying to break those soils, you know, 36 inches and deeper, start to break up any of the hard pans that are there from previous farming programs or other disturbance that we've done, that we're starting to see any kind of plow pans or hard pans or impermeable zones. So you get big material, big chunks, it's really aggressive soil disturbance, scouring through multiple soil layers. And that's what it looks like in the end. Now, if I went and flooded this afterwards, if I didn't follow up, I would go back there and I'd have cocklebur everywhere because of the diversity of soil chunks and all the faces that can germinate cocklebur. So we have to go in and do something different. So now I want to emulate this event. And so I'll go in with like a Rome disc or some kind of heavier disc and start to break those chunks up, doing that scouring. So I'll end up with my soil structure then will start to look like this. And I could go in, depending on the plant community I wanted, I could flood this. And with the diversity of chunks and stuff I'll get a higher plant diversity in there, but I'll get a higher degree of non-desirables like cocklebur. So, you know, it's that balance in between how much diversity do I want, how much management do I want to do later in the season. If I want to invest in cocklebur management, I may leave it like this for the diversity. Then we have this deposition event that happens as the river's receding and you get that slow drawdown. This can be really key to our cottonwood management if we're going for riparian management, or it can be key to our drawdowns as well. So I'll go in with like a finish disc or a harrow or some kind of soil finisher to get a smoother surface. And so at the end, my soil structure will look more like this. Real fine material, uniform soil surface. And that'll give me, so what I end up now then is I tend, because I've made a uniform soil surface that has a relatively uniform slope, I'm going to get a relatively uniform plant response. And so generally what I'll see is on a site like this, just coming out of disturbance, I'm going to get a really, depending on my drawdown date, I'm either going to get a really uniform crop of smart weeds, or I'm going to get a really uniform crop of sprangle-top or millet, depending on the timing of the drawdown, because it's uniform and set in place. So then this guy, the droughting and cracking, like I said, I think this is kind of a cool process because we just don't think about it. But you have, you know, the way it's working, you get all these soil beds are starting to form, all these prisms are forming. They dry at the top, and then they start to get smaller cracks going on in the top, and that falls down into the crack. And if you watch them over a long enough time, they eventually will fill once you start getting a bunch of sand blowing, the wind blowing and stuff. And you get this cool rotation of those soils going on at a really fine scale, and you can get a really, really unique plant community that'll come out of this, because you'll get germination, not necessarily going up on the top of the bed, but you'll get a lot of germination going on down through the crack where the soil moisture is the highest. And then you get a really good diversity of crops as well, and a lot of those non-desirables don't do well in this type of system because they don't get the germination event like the cocklebur doesn't do as well with this type of drug. And then we use something like a tiller. We have a big ag tiller that we can go in. This will disturb the soils at 4 to 6 inches depending on how deep we set the tiller, but then you get a really, really uniform soil type.
So those are all feds, John? I mean, you got 3 guys watching the guy run.
I think this used to be a DU engineer. So this is what my, just a hypothetical scale. This is how I think of a managed disturbance on 4 independent units on a broad time scale. So I have a lot of units that may be getting no disturbance for a substantial period of time because they're going through that aging that Colin was talking about. You don't want to constantly be disturbing because then you are going to move it towards one type of plant community. You'll get like a sprangle top or a millet community that just never changes. Then I've got, you can see in my red, I've got, every once in a while I'm going in with the root plow or doing that really heavy disturbance. But interspersed in there, I've got quite a few tilling events, quite a few low disturbance events. In our system, when you look at the natural hydrograph and the plant community, about 5 years is the disturbance rotation. 5 to 8 years is when you need to go in and disturb it. I mean, every unit is different. I mean, the one thing you learn quickly in wetlands is that even within a unit, nothing acts the same because of the soils, the soil types, and the way the community is set up. But in general, it's a 5 to 8 year cycle. And we've actually, in New Mexico, historically, the wetland dogma was they laser leveled everything for efficiency of water, because you could know how your irrigation was going to go and you can predict your plant response a lot more effectively. And so we do have quite a few laser leveled fields, but all of our newly developed wetlands, we're not laser leveling. We're going for that higher amount of microtopography and plant diversity. But you can feed a whole lot of birds in a laser leveled field if you grow it right. And so this is what we're going for. I mean, all these actions that we're ultimately doing, I guess we're spending a lot of money to grow a lot of weeds if you boiled it down to what our job is. But this is what we're looking for. The millets, that's a lot of sprangle top in the background. This is, you can see we have a little bit of cocklebur out there, but there's the smart weed communities we're looking for. And again, we're not just looking for the plant crop, we're thinking of that diversity in terms of plant succession and then invertebrate succession. So we want our plant communities to be able to feed birds, feed invertebrates, which ultimately are going to feed birds. So that's the way we're set up in our system. So that's about all I have on that. Any questions on any of that kind of stuff? Did I do okay with that?
Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.